It's time to get started. Give everybody a minute. Okay, I'll just go over the sick list right now. I think Billy and Delia are going to be at worship service. Then Leonard Clark's got upcoming surgery. Tommy, as I discovered, he's got the skin cancer there where they had taken a sample there, a biopsy, so he'll have to have that seen about on his nose. And are there any more sick this morning? Sherry Wilkins. She just plain old sick or got COVID or? Okay. I guess that.
Thanks, guys, for that. All right, we're in Acts chapter 27, and we're looking forward to our continuing study of Paul's journey to Rome. And we've pointed out how this chapter is unique in the book of Acts because it provides so much detail about the actual travel. And so we'll be resuming our study about this in verse 9. Think about the details of Paul's journey. As we look at the balance of the book of Acts, that is just the last two chapters, 27 and 28, we find this sequence of events. If we just think of where Paul is, he goes from Caesarea to Crete, and that's what we've read so far in the first 8 verses of chapter 27. Then most of chapter 27 is about this part of the voyage from Crete to the island of Malta, on which, at which time they have to abandon ship, and it is torn up in the surf. Then they winter on Malta, and then in Acts chapter 28 we read about the journey as it continues after the winter, and they go from the island of Malta all the way to the city of Rome. So as we reflect upon this, I remind you that Paul was encouraged during his time in Jerusalem when things were unsettled, and it was a dangerous time for Paul. In fact, we know shortly after this that this plot was uncovered where the people who were opposed to Paul were going to lie in wait and kill him. So why is all this happening? Why are these people so hostile against this person, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ? Well, this is the developing saga, this is the developing story, really from Acts chapter 9 through the end of the book. That once Paul became a Christian, he became the focus of hostility by those religious elites in Jerusalem. And why was that the case? Why did Paul become such a focus of hatred that we can follow from Acts chapter 9, when he became a Christian, all the way to chapter 28, the rest of the book? We can follow all of this trouble that Paul experiences as people try to hunt him down, as they try to conspire to kill him. Why does he become the focus in the book of Acts of all of this hatred? What's the answer? That's right. He was the leading persecutor. And when the Jews lost their leading persecutor and he flipped and became a Christian, that was a big embarrassment, you might say. And Paul was very successful at traveling all over the Mediterranean world and preaching the gospel. And where would he often go in a city if he could? First, the synagogue. And he was successful in some of those places, because he would open the scriptures and show people that Jesus is the Christ. He's the promised one of the whole Old Testament. And so as we appreciate that, we put ourselves into this moment that the very reason Paul is making this dangerous voyage to Rome is because one of these governors in Caesarea, the second one, Festus, had suggested that he go back to Jerusalem and be tried again there. Paul knew that that was a problem. That was dangerous. And he said, because he was a Roman citizen, I appeal to Caesar. And so Festus then is sending him to Rome. That's why he's making this journey. And it all goes back to who Paul is. As the former persecutor, now Christian, and leading now evangelist in the book of Acts, teaching people how to be saved. So one of the things we raised was this promise. Paul was in Jerusalem. It was a very dangerous time. He had been attacked when he was in the temple, and they had beaten him and would have beaten him to death had it not been for the soldiers who came and rescued him. But now he's incarcerated. They want to know why. He's a troublemaker. And we have this series of hearings from chapter 24 onward. And it's when he's in Jerusalem. I want to reread this verse that you see on the screen. The following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." And so this was the Lord's encouragement to him, because things did not look so good at that very moment. So the implication was, you're going to survive what's going on here in Jerusalem because I have plans for you to go to Rome. Well, it took several years for these plans to develop. And Paul did not have the Lord's playbook in front of him to know moment by moment what may happen. He had to live life just like you and I do, understanding God has made us promises, but those sometimes are conditional promises, and if we choose to go the other way, then we forfeit those blessings. But Paul didn't know any more than we do what's going to happen minute by minute. And so one of the, I think, very important messages of chapter 27 that is more detailed about Paul's travel than any other chapter is that this was a very dangerous, life-threatening situation. And I think that is definitely one of Luke's points in being so detailed about where they were, the time of year, how many days, how the sailors tried to navigate in the storm. He goes through and tells us all of these details because it's only then we can come to appreciate that even the sailors themselves thought this is hopeless, that they're going to die at sea. And so we see Paul rising to a place of influence and verbally expressing his faith in a very, very difficult and dangerous situation. So we'll talk more about that as we get to certain details, but this is not just an interesting chapter as part of Luke's travel diary where he just got fascinated with the details. It really plays an important role in helping us appreciate God had plans for Paul. Paul didn't know minute by minute how those things were going to work themselves out. And he had to trust in God through some hard, hard stuff. But we see in the end that God gets him to Rome, where he wants Paul to preach the gospel. So, I've provided an outline. Some of you may have this already. There's extra copies up here. And it's just a nice handy guide to, if you want to on your own go back and read through chapter 27 and just think about what a dangerous time this was for Paul, his friends, and all those people on board. And Paul cared about them all. What we're going to do is we're going to begin our reading now in verse 9. We're in Acts 27 and verse 9. And I'm going to put this map back up on the screen and remind you that last week we started here and we got to here. So Acts 27, as we begin to read and as we go through the first several verses, takes us to here. And when we begin to read in verse 9, it's leaving Fair Havens. They're wanting to get to Phoenix, but they end up at the end of the chapter in Malta. All right? Let's read verse 9. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them. Now, this is an important detail that identifies the time of year. The fast refers to the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was a special day with the Jews as per the law of Moses. And it was also called the fast because it was the single Jewish holiday or holy day that required a fast. It was a mandatory fast that on that day, the Day of Atonement, that the Jews fast. So that wasn't a part of the Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles. Those were feasts in which the various aspects of worship and celebration were associated with certain kinds of meals. This day, the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went into the holy place and all of that, was a fast day. Well, why is that important? Because it pinpoints the time of year. And what Luke is saying, because it's now in the fall of the year, it's getting to the time of year where it's dangerous to travel. In Paul's day, sea traffic on the Mediterranean came to a halt around this time. There was a window when people might still sail, but by the time you get to the 1st of November until March, nobody gets out on the sea in this day and time. It's too unpredictable. It's too dangerous as there are storms that are typical throughout this season. But here they are in this maybe last opportunity, the tail end of a voyage. And Paul says, men, I think we need to reconsider going any further. So let's read this part and think about it for a minute. Some estimate, and I don't know how specific we can be, but you can rebuild a general chronology of Paul's travels based on certain details in the book, like who was governor when and where and all of that. So there's some very specific things. Once you start building this chronology, some estimate that this could be somewhere around the year 59 AD. And if that were the case, the Day of Atonement in AD 59 was on October the 5th. So whatever specific year it was, we're talking about probably late September, early October, maybe mid-October. That's the time of year. So Paul says, now who's Paul on this ship? He's a prisoner. And they usually look to prisoners, don't they, for advice on navigation and sailing and all of that. But we're gonna kind of peel this back and think about it for a minute. Paul says, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Now, I think it's significant that Paul here is sharing his feeling about this decision. Remember, not everything that Paul ever uttered was Christian doctrine. He could have a conversation about what to have for dinner and when to leave town, and it wasn't Christian doctrine. When he taught as an apostle, it was always, of course, what Jesus wanted him to teach. Later, he's going to learn nobody's going to be lost. And when he makes this prediction later, it is significant. He says, "I've been told this by God." So this is not a prophetic statement here, but it is Paul saying, notice, I think it stands to reason that this is dangerous to keep going. And we should be concerned about the danger of going any farther. And so we'll think about this a little more, but let's take in what happens. Verse 11. The centurion paid more attention to the pilot, the King James says the master, and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. I don't guess that's unusual, is it? But we read in verse 12, "And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there." So they were all in agreement. We don't need to go much farther. But you see on the map what the plan is? They're right here. And you can kind of see that there's a change in the topography of the coastline here. They need to go around this little point and just sail 30 to 40 miles or so and get to Phoenix, which is a much better place to winter. It sounds from the description that the harbor itself provides more security for the ship, so it's not just beat to death all winter long. So the harbor is better. Maybe the town is even better. How many people are on board? Well, we know there's 276 people on board. So they're going to come into this town. So maybe in Fair Havens, there's not a suitable place for all these people to lodge and have provisions. But certainly, where the ship is going to rest through the winter is of concern. We will reiterate that this is the ship they got on in Myra. They started on one ship that was based in Asia Minor on the northern coast. But they found a grain ship from Alexandria and decided to change ships because this one's heading to Italy. So they're going to winter, they propose, in a better harbor west, still on the island of Crete, but just a little west from their current location. Now let's think about Paul interjecting himself here for a minute. I don't suppose he's acting as an apostle. Like, as an apostle of Christ, I want to give you sailing advice. Now, I'm sure if the Lord had wanted to give sailing advice, it'd be perfect. But I don't think that's what Paul's doing. That is acting in an official capacity as an apostle of Jesus. What I mean by this is Paul is a passenger on the ship. And why wouldn't he be concerned? Paul did not operate like this. I can remember when the Lord stood by me that night and he told me, just like you've testified about me in Jerusalem, you got to go to Rome. So no big deal. If you want to make dangerous decisions, it's not going to matter. The Lord has got your back. Just don't worry about it. Maybe the Lord remembered the temptation of Jesus when the devil said, why don't you cast yourself down? Took him up to the pinnacle of the temple and said, just throw yourself down. Because God has promised to take care of you. He'll send His angel to bear you up and your foot won't dash against a stone. And Jesus said, don't put God to the test. You know, Jesus has promised us, I will be with you always, even unto the end of the world. That doesn't mean to throw common sense out the window and live recklessly and dangerously. So Paul knows God has made him a promise. The Lord made him a promise. But that doesn't mean you live recklessly and dangerously and just say, oh, well, the Lord's got it covered. Now that's being presumptuous about the Lord. And that's what Jesus says we shouldn't do. You should not put the Lord your God to the test. Okay, that's a whole idea to explore if we would want to, but what we're asking here is, what is Paul doing? I think, if anything, one bit of insight is found when he writes the letter called 2 Corinthians. In terms of time, he wrote it around the beginning of Acts chapter 20, so whatever he wrote in 2 Corinthians has already happened. One thing he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and around verse 25, when he's talking about all the things he had already gone through, he said, I've been shipwrecked 3 times and spent a day and night in the deep. To me, that's why Paul decides to speak up. Because you just don't forget getting shipwrecked. It makes you a little bit paranoid. And Paul didn't have that happen once. He didn't have it happen twice. 3 times, and one time he says, I spent a day and a night adrift. So I go back and wonder about what those experiences were like for Paul. Did he see crews making bad decisions? Was everyone simply just, an unfortunate circumstance? Or can he look back and see that those crews made bad decisions or risky decisions? Paul had enough experience to say, listen, I know things don't always turn out well. And I think it's the better part of wisdom for us to stay put. I think he interjects himself at the very least because he's been there. He has done that. And he knows it can happen. And so I think what we should feel is a certain amount of tension. Don't read this verse and say, well, Paul, he advised, maybe we should, why does he advise this? Because he's worried about the danger. And you might remember that they've already had a difficult voyage so far in terms of fighting the wind. Luke has made that clear. So his previous experience, the difficulty they've already had so far, this is his concern. So I feel some tension here in Paul's feeling about what these men are inclined to do. And so they make the decision to push forward. Let's read, beginning in verse 13, about what happens. You see here on the map, this is where they propose to go. Do you notice the red line doesn't go there? Because as soon as they round this point and they're clear from the coastline that provided some protection from the wind shifts and it drives them in a southwest direction. They cannot even go up the coast to Phoenix, which they could probably do in a relatively short period of time, maybe a day. And so here we think about what happens. Verse 13. Look how detailish Luke is. Now when the south wind blew. So the wind changed direction. Now there's a south wind that's just going to carry them along. When the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, thinking now it's a good time to set sail and carry out their plan to go to Phoenix or Phoenice, if you're reading from the King James. They weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon, a tempestuous wind called the northeaster. And if you're reading from the King James, you have the word Euroclydon. And that's an anglicized form of the original word. It's a combo word. It's a Greek and Latin compound word. And so other versions try to, instead of just giving us that odd word that is difficult to even know what that means, will render it a northeaster. So the point is, and this is very significant, they had a word for this. They had a word for the type of weather now that they were going into. And it was a hurricane force wind, a tempestuous wind. And what we're going to see in the details that Luke gives are the effects of the severity of this storm. Let's just kind of with a bird's eye view think about what happens. The sailors take drastic measures. They are terrified that they might be driven to a place of destruction. The Greek word is the cistus, or some versions have the sandbar. It's a certain region on the North African coast that was a sailor's graveyard. They knew the wind was driving them in that condition and were out of control. So they take desperate measures. We'll talk about all those desperate measures. We have indications about the direction of the measures they took to avoid being driven far to the south. It seems from the description they turned the boat and laid it over basically on its side and tried to keep from being driven directly with the wind and go diagonal as much as they can. And in all the measures that they take, we learn how severe this storm was and should, I think, conclude reasonably that at some point the boat was leaking. And they began to be terrified. They were going to be lost at sea. So what does all that have to do with? Well, all of these details give us a picture that this is a very, very dangerous 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks from leaving Fair Havens to the time they abandon ship and swim ashore at Malta. It is a miserable, miserable time. And so they take drastic measures. They're fighting against this storm. They hadn't seen the sun or the stars for 2 weeks. Nobody has wanted to eat anything. And, right, they may be sick. Not only that, they're just trying to keep the boat in the water. Trying to keep it from sinking, trying to keep from being driven out of control. And just the thought of trying to stand or sleep or anything like that is just beyond comprehension. So when you hear Paul address the crew and the passengers and the other soldiers, don't think of him standing on the deck on a sunny, beautiful day and say, can I have your attention, please? I mean, they are up and down and blown with ocean spray. We know it is raining because when they get on the island of Malta, they're freezing to death, and the natives on the island build a fire, and Luke says it's raining and cold. So you just kind of keep putting all these details together to give some perspective when Paul says, an angel stood by me last night and said, we're going to make it. And then he says, I believe God. And it will happen as he said. I mean, that is the center of this account. So let's see how this plays out. So they thought things were going well. They had a gentle breeze blowing from the south, and they began sailing along the coast, heading west. But soon, this hurricane force wind coming out of the northeast struck down from the land, the ESV says. Crete has 3 main mountain ranges on it. And so we see the description here that this wind came upon them. Verse 15 says, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. They could not steer the ship in such a way as to maintain their course. Now, I don't know anything about sailing, and maybe you do, but previously my perspective was, the only way to get where you're going if you're sailing is you need the wind to blow from behind you and push your sail. Well, that's not how it works. A sail can work that way, but you've probably seen other types of sails than just a big square sheet. Some are triangular in shape and function more like the wing of an aircraft. So they can actually go into the wind, and the wing creates, or the sail creates, a lift effect, and they're able to actually go diagonally into the wind, and they will tack, they will zigzag. So even though the wind's not behind you and driving you, which would be the most ideal way, you can still go against the wind. Luke says, we couldn't do anything. We could not turn the ship into the wind and adjust for it because it was so strong. Not only the wind, but the effects then of the sea. So the waves, of course, are more severe with this tempestuous wind. So what happened? We had to give way to it, and we were driven along. That's why they end up by this little island just south of Crete called Cauda or Clauda. Now here's what it says. Running under the lee of a small island named Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Now you might have a little bit different rendering there, but what is being discussed is they had a small boat, one that they could use if they had anchored offshore in a harbor and they could row to land, or they could use it for a lifeboat. They had this little boat that would be towed behind. And he says, once we got under the cover of this little island and had a little protection from the wind, they decided we better get that boat on board. Bring that from being towed and secure that lifeboat on the deck of the ship or on the side of the ship. And so while that sounds like a simple task, it sounds to me like a very difficult task. You can imagine the crew, the strength. That little dinghy probably has a lot of water in it. There's no telling the lengths they had to go to get this small boat on board. This is giving us two very important details. Number one, it is giving us an illustration of how difficult things have become. Number two, it gives us some perspective about this boat being on board later when the sailors decide to use it to escape. And that's an important detail because even the sailors thought, we better get off this ship. That's how dangerous it was. So let's think about the measures that they take. So verse 17 says, after they hoisted up this smaller rowboat, they used supports to undergird the ship. And again, there's a little variation in versions here, but essentially the same thing is being described, however it's rendered. They take some ropes or some ropes that are threaded with fine cable. They take some kind of rope type device, whatever material it was made from, and they wrap the boat. Now that sounds like an extreme measure, doesn't it? According to some ancient sources, they would wrap it maybe 4 or 5 times. I mean, why are you tying up the boat? Because you're concerned. There's no telling what kind of creaking and noise. And they take this opportunity when they're under the lee of this little island to say, we've got to take some drastic measures. And they let down this and wrap it maybe 4 or 5 times to keep the hull of the ship intact. From some reading, it appears that the hull of the ship was stressed in these kinds of storms, not merely from waves beating against it, but it also had this center beam or mast going, and it's attached down in there. That's like a big lever. And the creaking and the stress on that hull was real. Now, the thing doesn't have to come all apart to create a dangerous situation. All you need is a leak. And that creates a big, big problem. So these measures that Luke records that the sailors are taking are indications of how dangerous the situation had become. So they got the little boat up. They used supports to undergird the ship. then fearing that they should run aground on the sandbar, the King James says something like that, or the Greek word that's just brought into the text in the ESV, the Syrtis, because they were worried about being driven in that direction, they lowered the gear, or they took some drastic measures to make some adjustments. Some of that's difficult to translate. But they did that, and thus, or in that way, were driven along. And that's where some think that they have tried to, at this stage, maneuver the boat in such a way that they could angle it or put it on its starboard side, put it on its right side to kind of counteract the effect of the wind. You see this right here? This is what they're afraid of. This wind that's coming out of the northeast would blow them in that direction. And I've included in the handout or the outline 2 long quotes about this region and how it was a notorious area, what they called the sailor's graveyard. And they thought, we're just out of control. And the hurricane force winds are driving us that direction. And it's only because of all the drastic measures the sailors take that they're able to just kind of diagonally fight this wind. So if they drift at a rate of 1.5 miles an hour, if they are just laid over and letting the wind take them, but angling the boat in such a way as try not to be driven directly with the wind, and they drift at a rate of about 1.5 miles an hour, in 2 weeks' time, they would go about 477 miles. And guess how far the island of Malta is from Crete? It's that far. The details that are included here and the lengths at which people have gone to actually go to the region and study the ocean floor, study the position of the islands, the coastlands, all the descriptions, just checks out in every minute detail. That just reminds us what we have said all along, that this is an accurate, very detailed account about the beginning of the church. And all of these details are just further authentication of the details that we're reading are accurate. So we're reading along here and thinking about how dangerous it's become. And verse 18 says, since we were violently storm-tossed, they begin the next day to throw stuff overboard. So you see, day after day, they're trying to take measures. Let's lighten the load of this ship. And maybe it will help. Maybe if they lighten the load of the ship, where the ship is linking will come above the line of the water. I don't know, but they thought this is something that we need to do. And they do this several times over the course of this journey. So then verse 20 says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Now, he has given us these details to bring us to that conclusion. It wouldn't make sense for him to say, we left Fair Havens and there was a storm and we had all thought it was over. You don't come to that conclusion until you understand the ferocity of the wind, all of the measures that they took, all of the efforts that they took, and the dangers that they were in because the boat was in danger of coming apart. Once you understand these details, you can hear what Luke says. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Which would be one way to say, we had no idea where we were. There's no way to navigate when you can't see the stars. No, they didn't have a GPS or anything like that. They didn't have any stars either, right? Because they couldn't navigate. And they're just adrift and fighting the wind. And after many days, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And so you could probably have tracked this every 24 hours. Desperate measures. Let's make an adjustment. Let's try this. And at some point, when you're adrift and have no idea where you are in the Mediterranean Sea, you can do the math and say, we're taking on water faster than we're getting anywhere. This is looking dire. And then Paul speaks. Paul, the encourager. Paul, the man of faith, who then becomes a central figure in the events that follow. And we'll just conclude with this. We're out of time for our Bible class this morning. But it's going to be interesting how Paul, who was first ignored, is now paid attention to. And he will, in this moment of a very difficult and dangerous situation, express his faith in God. There's a powerful lesson in that in and of itself. Well, we'll pick back up in verse 21 next week. Thank you so much for being in our Bible study.